Hello, everybody. So, today we're starting on the second volume of the Libertines, the second and final volume of the Libertines. Where are we? Well, yesterday we had a separate subplot. So, the day before, and the story that we're going back to today to some extent, was about Alexo, and he is now with Don Alfonso and Clorinda and Jacques. So they're the family of Cleanthe, long story short, the woman whose letter he found in the prison in the Inquisition in which he was imprisoned. And they've escaped from loads of robbers and stuff, and they're on the way out. Yesterday, we read about what happened with Father Jerome, de Caras and Bessare, who were respectively the most evil of all priests, an evil priest and the evil abbess. Now, the Caras and Bessare are both dead, and Jerome is triumphant as far as we know so far. So that's where we are with a couple of the different subplots. So I am going to start today's reading. There's nothing else really to say as introduction. So chapter 7, and the epigraph is not from Akenside. Yay! It's from Titus Andronicus. Shakespeare, presumably. So 'tis policy and stratagem must do that you effect, and so must you resolve, that what you cannot as you would achieve, you must perforce accomplish as you may. So, in the first chapter of this work, mention has been made of the initiation of Alexo into the monastery of St. Dominic. After that ceremony was performed, the perfidious Roderigo retired to a castle in his possession, and which was situated in New Castile. A cavalier, apparently of distinction, was soon after received into his family, but no person in the household except Roderigo knew anything concerning him or the object of his visit. He generally devoted his evenings to contemplation in the solitudes of the gardens which belonged to the castle, or in some silent walks that were contiguous to a ruinous chapel, at no great distance from the walls of the edifice. He played exquisitely upon the flute, and was a poet. The following ode was written by him as he sat sequestered in those gloomy solitudes, musing upon past events. Ode to Contemplation. You know it's going to be a good one. Now, evening dimmed appears, that much-loved hour of sweet tranquillity and rural ease, when far afield is heard the ploughman's simple song, and from the bean field sings the labouring bee, warned homeward by the coming shades of night, and dews that gently fall on every drooping flower. With contemplation, let me seek to dwell in wild romantic vale or ruin dark, where the swift circling bat flits in the twilight way. And oft in sheepcote near, the pleasing sound of warning bell is heard, as Philomel, in echo's mournful haunts, sings her sad tale of woe. Or if by musing memory fondly led to poor Matilda's turf of fading flowers, meet me in holy guise, O maid, revered by those who love to shed affection's hallowed tears, unmarked at night, when through the fleecy clouds that veil her azure sphere the wan moon dimly shines. But when drear winter saddens all the plain, and by the cheerful fire at close of day I hear the bleak winds mourn around my reed-thatched hut, the muse my lonely hours shall oft beguile, and thou, sweet maid, the willing mind shalt store with pity, meek content, and friendship's sacred law. As night appears big with the wintry storm, then shall the glimmering lamp with cheering ray beam o'er the neighbouring plain or mountain's lonely side. For oft poor travellers benighted stray wide of the village patch at that dark hour when not a watchdog barks or distant sheep bell sounds. While lingering onward near the chasm's depth, concealed by drifted snow, as the cold blast howls through leafless thorn and windings of the steep. One evening, as he was returning to the castle from his solitary retirement, a girl, apparently the daughter of a cottager, delivered him a billet which contained the following mysterious admonition. Put no confidence in Roderigo's friendship. He is a villain. If you watch in the gallery of the great hall when the clock strikes 2, something may probably happen to confirm my assertion. He ordered a fire that night to be lighted in his chamber and retired early to rest. His books alone afforded him amusement until midnight, when he lay down upon his couch and fell into a light sleep. The clock was striking two as he awoke. He armed himself with a dagger and proceeded to the gallery that looked into the great hall. A solemn stillness reigned in every part of the castle, As he descended into the hall, the glimmering of a light at the upper end of the gallery revived his hopes of discovering something of importance. The light continued to approach. He cautiously ascended the stairs and discovered old Dorinda, the housekeeper, enter the mysterious chamber, with a basket upon her left arm which was apparently filled with provisions. His curiosity prompted him to follow her, for as no person but Roderigo and the confessor were ever permitted to enter that room, he felt an unusual degree of anxiety to discover the secret of the chamber. He listened at the door, which was left ajar, and concluded from the stillness which prevailed in the chamber that he might enter it with safety. He gradually opened the door, and by the faint light of the morning which shone through the window, he perceived the floor in many places crimsoned with blood, and that the bed curtains and furniture, although fallen into total decay, exhibited the same marks of cruel villainy. The secret was now... page jump. The secret was now discovered. The scene before him sufficiently proved how far it would be prudent in him to remain a domestic of a castle, the retreat of murderous adventurers, and which, in all probability, would one day become his grave. He was about to quit the room when a beam of light darted through a crevice in a door at the upper end. He daringly approached, and opening it, found it led into a small passage which communicated with one of the strong towers that were built for the protection of the castle. Incautious in his inquiries, he ventured into the passage and had nearly been discovered by Dorinda, whom he accidentally observed at the extremity, fastening a strong iron door. As she held her lamp up to observe whether she had secured it effectually, he suddenly quitted the apartment, and reaching his chamber in safety, sat down upon his couch, overpowered with horror and the tormenting pangs of reflection. Roderigo's character he had, since his residence in the castle, found out by his domestics not to be of the first consequence in the estimation of mankind. The dreadful appearance of the chamber now confirmed his suspicions. But the basket which old Dorinda carried could not, he exclaimed, contain anything for the service of the dead. He paced the room in wild disorder, his mind harassed with the strange and unaccountable adventure he had met with, until the broad daylight illumined the neighbouring promontories around the castle. He retired to rest and rose late in the day. Suspecting him to be indisposed, Roderigo visited him in his chamber, but his mind was too deeply affected with the circumstances he had met with to engage in conversation with a man whom he suspected to be the villainous promoter of murder and oppression. He resolved, after some deliberation, to force from Dorinda the secret of the tower, and as the clock struck 12, he exclaimed, 2 hours must pass, and I will then, at the hazard of my life, discover the truth of my suspicions. A voice at that instant cried out, "Beware!" He started from his seat, and seizing a dagger which he had unsheathed and laid upon the table, looked fearfully around the apartment. It was gloomy, and free from any being but himself. The peasants of the neighbouring village had frequently told him that spirits had been seen in the castle by Conrad the porter, who usually took laudanum, to prevent those dreadful wanderers of the night from terrifying him into fits. His credulity, like poor Conrad's, almost got the better of his philosophy, for every noise increased the alarm which had at first nearly overpowered him, and the cheerful blaze of a good fire alone kept him from sinking into a state of melancholy horror. The clock at length struck 2, when, regardless of the supernatural warning he had heard, he extinguished his lamp and proceeded to the great gallery as before. The tranquil light of the morning, which the preceding night illumined as if by design, the gloomy chamber of iniquity, was now obscured by clouds, dark and big with storms. He waited for the old housekeeper a full hour in the gallery, but everything continued buried in the same death-like stillness. He stationed himself opposite the door of the mysterious chamber, but no sound whatever disturbed his reflections. A violent storm soon after broke over the battlements of the castle. It shattered the summit of the north tower. The falling of the fragments awoke Roderigo, who slept in an adjoining chamber, and ere the cavalier could possibly reach his apartment, he was met by the villain, who was dressed in a nightgown and carried in his right hand a naked sword. He held his lamp up as he approached the cavalier and exclaimed, "How now? Does this awful thunder appall your spirits as well as mine? I have not rested well these 3 nights. Have you been with the confessor? If not, return with me to him. He will be of service to us." He started as if suddenly recollecting some important circumstance, and turning to the cavalier with a yawning smile. I have not, said he, recovered a jovial carousal which I had about 3 days ago with a traveller who stopped at the castle. I must have my sleep up. The storm may continue if it please the disposer of it. I make no doubt you have often felt the dreadful sensations which naturally affect a nervous man roused from slumber by a thunderstorm, and the consequent languid depressions that follow his recovery. I am ill at this moment with them, and must wish you a good night. The first impressions of terror which seized the cavalier when he saw Rodrigo had now subsided, but fearful his continuing long in the gallery might lead to some suspicion, he parted with him at the door of his chamber. The peculiar language of Rodrigo, his method of address and appearance, awakened in the bosom of his guest the sure conviction of his guilt. The prospect of an escape began now to occupy his attention. His suspicions were too well founded of Rodrigo's having set spies to watch his conduct, for he never left the castle without observing some one of the household following him, and to effect his escape without the knowledge of Rodrigo he thought almost impossible. One night, however, made desperate by his reflections, he left his chamber with the positive intention of murdering old Conrad, the porter, as the only means of gaining his liberty. As he passed along the gallery, the door of the mysterious chamber, he observed, was open, as before. Regardless of the sudden trembling which instantly seized him, he entered the apartment, and finding his way to the iron door, descended a rough stone staircase into a passage, which he traversed with great dread and difficulty, until he observed some person before him with a lamp. It was old Dorinda. He carefully observed her conduct, and when she had gained the extremity of the passage, he saw, as she placed her basket on the ground, that it contained a small wine flask, a loaf of bread, and some fruit. She ascended a few steps and unlocked a small door, and as she threw it wide open, he discovered, during the time she descended for her basket, a female figure, with her eyes fixed upon the pages of a small book which she held in her hand. The old beldam closed the door when she entered the apartment, and he then approached near enough to hear his name mentioned with a deep and affectionate sigh. Maddened with surprise and horror, he, in the first moments of his agitation, was about to rush into the apartment, when the door creaked open upon its hinges and Dorinda reappeared. He fled swiftly from the spot, and secreting himself in an aperture of the wall, heard her mutter as she passed him. Love indeed. The devil fetch me if she shall ever see him. Without it serves my purpose too. In a few minutes the passage was in total darkness. He found his way to the cell and rapped at the door. Who is there? Exclaimed some person with a feeble voice. He was unable to reply. There was something in the tone of it that reminded him of his lost and beloved Cleanthe. He waited a few minutes and rapped again, at the same time exclaiming, Cleanthe? A loud shriek pierced him to the very soul. A dreadful pause of some moments ensued. He listened at the door and heard from someone burst into tears. I cannot, said he, possibly enter your prison, but tell me who thou art, and justice shall force the cause of your confinement to be explained by the master of this abominable haunt of villainy. Am I deceived? She replied. If I call upon my affectionate, my long-lost love, Bertram, to commiserate and endeavour to relieve the barbarous treatment his Cleanthe endures in this horrid prison? Almighty God! It cannot be! Is it possible that my Cleanthe lives? It is my Bertram, she exclaimed with the wildest cries of horror. He listened at the door. A groan only at intervals disturbed the solemn silence of her prison. Suspecting she had fainted, he ran, raging with despair, up the passage, uttering the loudest imprecations against Rodrigo and praying for the interference of God. A light shone upon the distant walls of the place. They are coming, he cried as he dashed himself against the door of the prison. They are coming to drag me from my love. Cleanthe, your barbarous persecutors approach. I shall meet my death as the angel of eternal happiness if you do not survive me. She groaned as if expiring. Thanks to God. That groan was the sign of death. We shall soon meet in heaven. He threw himself on the ground and laid for some time in a state of insensibility. In the interim, Dorinda arrived. A man, she cried, and dead too. Holy Father, Who can it be? Oh, Lord, it's the cavalier who resides in the castle. Poor gentleman, his hands are cold as the paws of a dead bear. Surely this will be a pretty tale for Rodrigo. How I shall be cuffed about for a month if he knows that he died in this place, and how, in the name of sin and misery, shall I be able to carry him away? She tried the salutary effect of fanning him with her mantle. He gradually recovered, and when he perceived the benevolent portress of the prison standing by his side, he rose in fury from the ground, and darting upon the hag, exclaimed, "Ah, miscreant, you are now at my mercy. Give me instantly the key of that dungeon, or I will sacrifice you directly to my fury." Merciful Father, how you grip me! Let me tell you, Sir Bertram, I cannot do it. Not do it? Sir Bertram, recollect my situation. A poor, helpless woman, debased with deformity. And if Rodrigo should kick me out of the castle, but pray, where am I to find a comforter? I cannot do it. Indeed, Sir Bertram, I cannot do it. She was retiring. You stir not from this place, he cried, until my request is complied with. Trifle with me no longer, for by the God above I will murder you if you persist in refusing my admittance to my beloved Cleanthe. Your beloved Cleanthe? Said the old beldam with a smile. Bertram interrupted her. Here is a ring of inestimable value. Take it. Be my friend, and all the wealth I am master of shall be yours. Many people know the real properties of gold. Dorinda was one of these connoisseurs. She produced the key and threw open the doors of the dungeon. I will return, said she, when I think it is time for you to leave the cell. What mind can conceive, what language express the distressed situation of Bertram when he beheld his beloved Cleanthe stretched senseless on the floor? He knelt by her side and gazed upon her in speechless horror. He observed her bosom violently agitated. It was the effect of returning animation, but to him it appeared the convulsive struggles of the departing soul. She cannot live, he exclaimed, falling on her neck. She cannot live, but we will be buried in one grave. Our dust may be united in the tomb. As he poised the dagger at his breast, she faintly exclaimed, Forbear, I live. He dropped the poignard on the ground and raised her in his arms. Oh dear. She reclined her head upon his neck and burst into tears. The effect of agonizing sorrow overpowered the faculty of speech. They continued for some time in this situation, until Bertram, pressing her to his bosom, exclaimed, Have you no suspicion of the cause which condemns you to confinement in this horrible place? Oh, I'm too well acquainted with the motive that induces my villainous persecutor to keep me in his power. Since that fateful night in which you quitted Madrid for Andalusia, I have been the victim of the most abandoned cruelties. Here she related to him her unjust confinement in the prison of the Inquisition by Jerome, father of the Order of St. Dominic. This castle, she continued, is the property of a villain under the influence of that inquisitor. For when I first came here, I was treated with great respect, but on the arrival of a horseman who brought letters for the master of the castle, I was thrown into this dungeon. I have received a wound in my left breast from the hand of Jerome as I resisted his brutal violence to my person. The dampness of the dungeon increased an inflammation which had taken place, and fearful it might endanger my life, I compelled Dorinda by tears and entreaties to represent my situation to her master. She did so, and I was instantly moved to a small room in one of the towers. His confessor there attended me with medicines and everything necessary for my comfort. And when he reported me sufficiently recovered, I was again sent back to this place, where I have borne a long and unjust confinement without the hope of ever regaining my liberty. Do not despair, cried Bertram. We may possibly soon effect it, for I will tomorrow go to Madrid and lay the whole affair before the great officers of the law. They cannot refuse me their assistance to bring this barbarous libertine and his confederates to justice. God only knows the extent of my extreme distress when I returned to Madrid and found your house totally deserted. I searched every street in the metropolis. I employed friends to make inquiries in the neighbouring provinces. I ranged through the suburbs of the city as one distracted. No person that dwelt near you had heard of your departure until I mentioned it. I gave myself up to despair, and the pressure of my misfortune soon reduced me to the necessity of keeping my bed. Suspecting my father to be unacquainted with my arrival and hoping an opportunity so favourable for a reconciliation would not be treated with contempt by him, I dispatched a servant to his house with the information of my indisposition and a pressing request that he would visit me. He returned with an answer from my father's banker that he had, soon after the decease of my mother, initiated my sister into the convent of St. Catherine's and retired into a distant city. This unexpected evil added to my misfortunes the dreadful malady of melancholy. My physicians then advised me to retire into the country and unbend the mind from reflection by the diversions it afforded. Their advice was so powerfully seconded by my confessor, and who, from certain mysterious circumstances which I remarked in his behaviour, must be the very same friar whose villainy you have experienced, that I consented to adopt the proposal. Rodrigo was introduced to me by the friar as a gentleman of birth, fortune, and education, and who, he said, would willingly admit me into his castle, which was situated in the mountainous part of Extremadura, and well calculated for temporary retirement. For the sake of society. I observed to the great joy of the friar, became friends, and as previous to my departure from Madrid, I called at the grate of St. Catherine's convent and inquired for my sister. The abbess, informed of my arrival, came to the grate and told me she had been dead many months. I requested to see her tomb. No man ever enters these walls, she replied, and bidding me farewell, closed the door of the grating in my face. The situation of my mind at that moment cannot be conceived. I returned to Rodrigo's lodgings, and relating my adventure to him in the most impressive terms, begged that we might instantly quit the capital. But sure, some angel that ever watches over the fate of the unfortunate must have befriended me to have so fortunately discovered your retreat. They were interrupted by a rap at the door, and Dorinda entered the cell. It's almost high morning, she exclaimed, and ere long Rodrigo will be stirring. The keys of the private places in the castle I have always delivered to him the first thing. Therefore, you must separate now. Do not tear us asunder so soon, Dorinda, said Bertram. Leave me here until you return at midnight. By the Father of the Virgin, replied the hag. That will betray us to Rodrigo, and then, Sir Bertram, you'll be shut up in a prison, and I shall be minced alive for the hungry owls in the garden. No, you must part now, but I promise to conduct you here again at 12 tonight. They embraced each other with affectionate rapture, and after returning 1,000 hallowed kisses, bade adieu until the hour appointed by Dorinda for their next meeting. Bertram and the old woman hurried from the passage and parted at the door of his chamber. He lay down upon his couch and tried to refresh himself by repose, but in vain. If he slumbered at all, Cleanthe stood before him in her shroud, and if he mused upon his pillow, visionary murderers glided before his eyes. He spent the greater part of the day among the ruins, or in the most private avenues of the garden. The pleasing hopes of restoring Cleanthe to liberty alone occupied his thoughts. The strength of the castle and the attachment of the domestics to their master were disadvantages which he could not easily overcome, but he did not despair. Dorinda's conduct added fresh vigour to his hopes, and early in the evening he retired to his chamber and passed away the hours in reading the poetry and romances of Voltaire. The castle bell tolled 11. I would that it were 12, he exclaimed as he threw down the book and opened the window of his chamber. The moon was just rising above the mountains, and in the midst of his contemplations he heard his chamber door open. On turning hastily, as he thought, to welcome Dorinda, a man in complete armour approached him, and waving his truncheon for silence, repeated with marked emphasis the following lines. Unsuspecting youth, beware, trust not woman but with care. Perfidy and murder wait, attendant on thy settled state. Prize the stranger, prize the hour that warns thee of a villain's power. Immediately the unknown disappeared. He rushed into the gallery with his lamp, but no person was to be seen. The voice which he had heard in his chamber and the appearance of the man in armour almost deterred him from accompanying Dorinda that night to the prison. But in the midst of his deliberations, she rapped at his door. We must lose no time, she cried. Follow me directly. The idea of again beholding his adored Cleanthe instantly overcame every difficulty which had arisen in his mind respecting his safety, and he joyfully accompanied the old woman to the dungeon. She gradually unlocked the door, and when he rushed into the room, his terror and astonishment are more easily to be conceived than described, for he beheld Rodrigo with 3 of his confederates waiting his approach. Ah, villain, he exclaimed on seeing Rodrigo, your conduct shall be rewarded as it deserves. They seized him and loaded him with irons, and in a few minutes afterwards the lamp was extinguished, and they left him in the dungeon, raving with indignant fury and resentment. At the lower part of the cell was a grating which looked into a subterraneous passage, and one night, as he lay stretched upon the floor, almost senseless with grief and despair, he heard some person exhorting him to patience and courage. He approached the aperture and discovered it to be a domestic of Rodrigo's whom he had usually employed as his own servants from motives of humanity, the man being old and past the laborious duty of a menial servant. "Adieu, Sir Bertram," he cried, "but obeyed my injunctions, all would have been well. I tried to warn you of your situation by secreting myself in your chamber. I found it did not succeed, and took an opportunity of appearing before you in armour for the same purpose, but all would not do." "And was it you," replied Bertram, "that so advisedly foreboded the fatal consequences of trusting myself in Dorinda's power? Had you but laid aside your mysterious habit, I should have attended to you, and been happy." "Oh, my dear master, I thought you'd believe a ghost sooner than a superannuated old servant. Lord, one should have supposed the blood in the chamber you passed through to get to this dungeon would have frightened you out of your opinion. They say that Rodrigo's sister haunts that chamber. Dear heart, this is a sad place." "Oh, God of death, torture me no more with such terrible and alarming tales, but tell me if you know of my Cleanthe, and whether you can assist me to escape from the power of this villain Rodrigo." "Oh, dear heart, Cleanthe, poor dear, is confined in a dungeon, darker and more dismal than this, and no one person knows where it is but that old deceitful devil Dorinda and Rodrigo. And as for you escaping, by all the dead prophets—" "Hark!" cried Bertram. "I hear footsteps in the passage. Fly instantly, or you will be detected." He threw a billet into his prison and disappeared. Bertram had just sufficient time to conceal it in his bosom when the door opened, and 4 men entered his dungeon. His irons were immediately taken off by one of them, who seemed to be the leader, and in spite of his curses and supplications, they bound him with cords, and threatening him with death if he continued his imprecations, conducted him into the courtyard of the castle. He there observed 3 horses and a small carriage in waiting near the gate, and whilst preparations were making by the men for their departure, Rodrigo appeared at a window in one of the towers, holding Cleanthe in his arms. "Thus," he exclaimed, "I punish hypocrisy," and apparently stabbed her in the heart. Bertram at that moment felt the most unspeakable pangs of horror. He struggled to free himself from the power of his conductors, but in vain. They hurried him into the carriage, and quitting the castle, struck into a wild pathway over the mountains with their unfortunate and miserable prisoner. The castle gates were scarce closed for the night when Rodrigo was awakened by a loud tapping at the outer gate. He summoned the porter to his chamber, and inquiring the cause of the disturbance, received for answer that one of the men who had the care of Bertram was returned and requested to see him instantly. The fellow was admitted. A long and secret conference took place. "Are you sure of it?" cried Rodrigo. "I know them well," said the servant. "Order wine and provisions to be set before them, and desire the confessor to attend upon them until my appearance." He turned to his escritoire and took some papers from a small red leather case and examined them with profound attention. "These are certainly," he cried, "from this description of Jerome's the persons whom he most wishes to destroy, and by the fellow's account my nephew's amongst them. They shall not see the dawn of tomorrow. No, it shall be done tonight." It was the unfortunate Don Alfonso and his party, who, from a pressing desire to reach the capital without the least delay, had entered upon the mountains too late in the evening to cross them before morning, and having accidentally met the gang conducting Bertram on his journey, politely inquired of them their nearest way to the first village, but were answered that it was 9 leagues distant. The man mentioned the castle of Rodrigo as being inhabited by Augustin friars, and faithfully promised to conduct them to it without harm or hazard. They knew the benevolent inhabitants of religious houses usually lodged travellers for the night with great hospitality, and not feeling themselves very much disposed to pursue their journey, they desired the man to lead the way, promising him a reward if he proved worthy of it. As they were conversing upon different topics with much gaiety and pleasure, the confessor, who was seated at the top of the table, suddenly feigned sickness and disappeared. No person of the household after that moment, they thought, would appear in the hall again, for they constantly heard people hastily passing up and down the stairs, doors opening and shutting in the galleries, and at intervals loud imprecations, seemingly uttered by men in the execution of some important charge. "I fear," said Alfonso, "that we have fooled our lives away. These unusual and inhospitable circumstances lead me to suspect this castle to be the secret haunt of villainy." At that moment they heard several voices chanting a beautiful chorus of a hymn. Alfonso laid his sword upon the table, and climbing up to one of the windows which opened into the garden, observed with a great degree of astonishment 6 men accompanying a woman who was arrayed in white. She carried in her right hand a wax taper, and in her left a tablet on which he indistinctly discerned figures in different attitudes, carved along above a long inscription. They approached the castle and entered one of the towers. He had scarce time to communicate this strange and mysterious ceremony to his friends, when the large folding doors were thrown open, and the procession entered the hall, preceded by the confessor. The lady approached Clorinda, and taking her by the hand, presented her to a fat friar, who introduced her to the next, and he to the third, and so on, until she had received the holy salutation from the whole company. The same mode of etiquette was also observed to Alfonso and his friends. This unaccountable fast completed, the tablet was presented to Alfonso, who read aloud the following words, which were engraved under the emblematical figures of faith, hope, and charity. "The Augustin friars who inhabit this castle are devoted to religion and the faithful discharge of their duty towards their fellow creatures. The poor are at the gate of their sanctuary supplied with food and raiment. The rich receive their benediction, and the bewildered traveller an hospitable reception until he wishes to depart on his journey." The procession returned from the hall the way it came, and immediately lamps were brought in by 2 female servants, and the party conducted to separate chambers. This holy ceremony ill accorded with the blasphemous expressions they had heard uttered in the gallery. Suspicion was now completely awakened in the minds of Alexo, Jacques, and Don Bertram, and as they were retiring to their respective couches, Alexo observed a paper slipped under the door of the chamber. He took it up and read it to his friends. It contained the following words: "Open the door and admit a man who is your friend. He has something of importance to communicate." They consulted upon the propriety of such a step, conceiving that a party of banditti might rush in and put them to death without mercy. The man rapped gently and exclaimed, "Admit me. On your life, I am your friend." The circumstance determined them to see the stranger who requested so extraordinary a measure. It was a man wrapped in a soldier's cloak, and when he entered the chamber, pulling his hat from his brow, he exclaimed, "Have you no recollection, Alexo, of the man who introduced you to the Jew at Madrid as tutor to his son? My God, is it Pedro? And mischief is at hand." "Not quite so bad as that, sir. To be sure, I once played you a knave's trick, but I am now your friend. The man who inhabits this castle is your uncle." "Gracious God! Hear me. The fellow who conducted you here is Gaspardo, well known to you all, I have no doubt." The party surrounded him. "Hark!" He stepped softly to the door and secured it. "Rodrigo's title to this domain is written with blood. Deeds of the most horrid nature have been committed within these walls by those villains whom you saw in religious clothing. I have a knowledge of many private passages in the castle that lead into a ruinous chapel at some distance from the walls. One of them communicates with Alfonso's chamber. We must not trifle away our time, for if you do not quit the castle this night, you are totally lost." "How are we to reach the chamber of Alfonso unobserved?" said Alexei. "Follow me. All the inhabitants are at this moment watching upon the towers for the approach of several of their companions, whom, it is supposed, are overtaken by a band of armed peasants." They quitted the chamber, and proceeding to the room where Alfonso slept, with utter astonishment and horror, perceived it secured by a padlock on the outside. Observing, however, through a crevice that his lamp was burning, they immediately apprised him of his situation, and promised, if no accident happened to them, to come by a private way to his chamber. "Now," said Pedro, "we must make a desperate effort, and gain the holy tower. We can from thence get into Alfonso's chamber." As they followed him along the gallery, they could distinctly perceive lights upon the towers through the windows of the hall, and observed with great joy the old porter and Dorinda fast asleep before the fire. "All is well," cried Pedro. "The 2 guards are safe. In a few minutes we shall be out of danger." They descended a flight of steps at the end of the gallery, which led into a room that communicated with the tower. They then explored their way in total darkness through a winding passage to a small door at the summit of about 30 steps. Pedro rapped rather loud and called out, "Alfonso!" He answered and inquired how he was to be delivered from his perilous situation. "You will find," said Pedro. "A small door immediately behind that part of the arras where you see St. John's head on the charger." He had scarce spoken the words when they perceived the light shine under the door. Pedro instantaneously unlocked it by means of the housekeeper's key, which he had stolen from her whilst plying her with the best wine in the cellar. They took the almost expiring Clorinda in their arms, and following Pedro through several subterraneous passages, arrived without discovery at the outlet. As the morning was on the point of breaking, Pedro, when they entered the ruins, extinguished the lamp. He then desired them, with a peculiar degree of earnestness, not to stir from the spot until his return. "Return?" said Alfonso. "What, do you mean to desert us?" No. The mules, I expect, are already saddled in an adjoining valley. A confidential friend is stationed there with them, but for what purpose he knows not. After repeated assurance of his fidelity, they suffered him to depart. During his absence, those tedious moments were wasted by the travellers with a degree of dreadful apprehension, for Pedro's character was well known to Alexo, and his solemn protestation of friendship and integrity appeared to him only as a veil to cover his rascality. Their fears, however, were soon dissipated, for the fellow arrived punctually to his time with 3 mules equipped for a journey. They instantly mounted the animals, and in a few minutes gained an open plain. As they rolled furiously along the waste, they observed the light of torches continually flashing through the windows of the chambers and towers of the castle. "We have just escaped it," cried Pedro. "The storm is brewing. Lights appear everywhere in the castle. This way, gentlemen, this way." He stuck into a beaten pathway which they found led to the high road. The village steeple soon appeared, and before the sun had risen above the summit of the mountains, they alighted at a small inn near the entrance of the hamlet. They continued there but a sufficient time to refresh the beasts and themselves, when they hired a vehicle and proceeded with all possible dispatch to Madrid. They had, in their way to the hotel, to pass the monastery of St. Dominic. The vesper bell was tolling when they arrived in sight of it, and as they passed the gate, Clorinda, seized with sudden horror, caught hold of Alfonso and burst into tears. They observed with indignation several sanctified priests upon their knees in the porch before a wooden image, probably that of St. Dominic, whose blasphemous villainies first produced the execrable institution of the Inquisition. Some days elapsed before they ventured abroad, during which time they satisfied themselves as to the reality of the proclamation they had seen upon the road. They found it posted in the public places at Madrid, and learnt that it was formerly read in the streets by the officers under the crown. The dreadful ravages of time are never so faithfully observed by any person as by him who returns after an absence to the place of his nativity. Alfonso found many of his best friends in their graves, and others scattered by a variety of causes in distant parts of the world. The few, however, that remained welcomed him home with the most heartfelt congratulations, and promised him their interest and personal assistance to procure, if possible, redress for the unwarrantable injuries he had suffered. So, I'll finish for today. I'm sorry I kept laughing. I just couldn't help myself. It was very silly. Some bits of that were very silly. A lot of face blindness going on again. Gaspardo popping back up, but nobody recognized him. Yes. Alexa not recognizing his own uncle, presuming he was on the scene. Pedro not being recognized. It's all classics. I think my other favorite moment is the servant being like, "But wouldn't you have believed a ghost more?" I'm sure there's some cutting social critique going on there. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you tomorrow for the next episode of The Libertines. Bye-bye.